welcome to everybody. It's great to see everybody. Even though for the first time in 12 years, the entire staff is in one building. Everybody is busy running around, scattering, trying to get everything done. And you can tell there's a lot to do, and that's why I'm having trouble getting words out today. But I first want to thank the entire staff of the Whitney Museum. We are now, how many days left on your clock, John? Wherever you are? 43 days. That's to May 1. So you count back 15, which is making everybody nervous. But I do want to thank everybody on the staff of the Whitney Museum who have gotten us to this point, because everybody has put in so much of their time and their life and their energies into this. And, to quote Flora Biddle, the Whitney Museum is an idea, but it takes an awful lot of work to realize an idea. And I just want you to know how truly grateful I am for all you've done to get us here. It should be a great celebration shortly. I want to particularly thank the core team and all of the curators, headed by Donna De Salvo, our Deputy Director and Chief Curator. Donna has been my incredible partner in this whole odyssey that is now going on for 11 years. I realized the other day I said goodbye to Renzo Piano, and it was his last time on the site before the opening. It was the last project meeting. And so it was 11 years ago, Donna, that you and I started working with Renzo on this. And we had, first it was the Uptown. We had a lot of practice, and then we had Downtown. So, we didn't get it right the first time. Hopefully we got it right the second time. But as I've said all the way through this project, it's an extraordinary building, and I'm going to start by just saying a few words about the building itself, because you have the curators who've worked so long and hard on putting together the opening installation, which I have to say is truly extraordinary. When the first works of art went up in the building, it brought tears to my eyes to see the art there, because it's never been about the building as much as we've had to raise money for it and everything. It's always been the opportunities that we have to show the collection, to do exhibitions, and for artists to think about how they might use the space. So thank you all to the curators and for the presentations. And I also want to thank Catherine and the Education Department. It was Catherine's great idea to put this event together today. All of you, if you haven't already on staff, many have already started walking people through the building, but whether you're docents or whether you're front of line staff or whether you're an assistant working in a department, all of you here at one time or another will be walking somebody through the building and talking about whether it's the building or the collection or just providing people with directions and finding the way around the building. So I think this is a great orientation to get the whole thing off. So I thought I would talk for about an hour or so this afternoon. Donna, see, you only have to talk for 5 minutes after all. But now that I just said it isn't about the building, I will talk about the building, because this will be the only opportunity. And I just pulled a handful of slides because it's really not about the building that I want to go into in detail today, but it's really thinking, that any building is, first of all, it's representative of an idea, of a mission, of an ethos, of a philosophy, of a direction, and so there's nothing in this building that we thought of in a way that was really arbitrary. And the one thing that I've really been struck by is that, this new building is what I think of as a 360-degree building, meaning that it's one of the only museums that I can think of in New York that you actually see from 360 degrees. But maybe even more importantly, it's one of the only museum buildings that you look outside 360 degrees. And I remember something, actually, it was a metaphor, Donna, that you had brought forward a long time ago, the idea of the new building of being a beacon of sorts. And it's true. I mean, it's that sense that we are looking out on everything, and everybody is looking at us in an interesting way. And I think, if for those of you who remember pictures of the Whitney on A Street, it was embedded in brownstones. On 54th Street, we're in the shadow of the Museum of Modern Art, literally, and attached to the Museum of Modern Art. And even Breuer building is set, on a corner. And there's something about it, I almost feel like it's a bit of a coming of age, that we've sort of emerged, we're out of the shadows, we're no longer, part of the middle of something, but stand out on our own and look out in all directions. And one of the things that we feel, I know, isn't that look great? It's terrific. This is looking at the fifth floor gallery from the West Side Highway, and that's the Jonathan Borofsky that just went up in the building. And then this is looking out, I think, on the, is it the sixth floor terrace? I can't tell, probably. But sixth floor? Thanks. Sixth floor terrace. One of the things that was very important about this building, again, I'm not going into the details, is that idea of transparency and looking in and looking out. And it's the idea that when you're in the new building, you're always aware of where you are, in a sense. You come off the elevators, you get a sense that the river is off to your right, over to the west, and that the city is off to the left. But the idea that you can kind of look into it, and this is very different from, in fact, what Breuer thought of. I mean, Breuer's building, had often been thought of as a bunker. It's a wonderful building, but it's a totally enclosed space. It's not about being connected from the world. It's in fact about being cut off from the world in many ways, about having that drawbridge, about the big concrete thing. Renzo's approach was much more of that sense of transparency, connecting to the outside for people to get glimpses inside, and then when you're in the building, to have glimpses into different parts of the worlds within the building, glimpses into the office, glimpses into the study center, and you'll see that. It's almost as if there's slices through the building that give you a sense of that. But nonetheless, there are many, many echoes of the Breuer building, and it's one of the things I've realized that, when you realize with an architect like Renzo Piano, he's a man who is an incredibly confident man, who is incredibly comfortable in his skin. And, in many ways, there were things that we directly did that were functional things that we loved in the Breuer building that we repeated in the new building. For example, the elevators. The elevators all open directly into the galleries in the new museum. The big elevator, which is the freight elevator, is also an elevator for the public. Those kinds of things were conscious things that we did in the building. But then there were things, when Renzo came up with the idea of doing steps on the building, the ziggurat form, I don't think he was specifically thinking of Breuer, but in fact it was the Breuer building right side up as opposed to upside down, because the Breuer building was always thought of as the upside down building. But throughout the, whether it's the use of concrete, which happens all the way through the core of the building, the stone on the floors, even the stairwells, this is the stairwell that faces west, and that's the Breuer stairwell on the left. The Breuer stairwell is very enclosed, and it just get little windows out. But this idea of a ribbon stairwell that connects you out into the world, and that was one connection. Then Renzo was consciously thinking about that. So there were many ways in which, and it's something that we've said over and over again, what would be the greatest compliment that people could make when they come into the new building, and that is that it would feel and look like the Whitney. And over again, as we've taken critics through, people say, it feels like the Whitney, and yet it's totally different. The materials are not the same, the sense of lightness is not the same, but there's something about it that seems to be somewhat reminiscent and characteristic of the Breuer building. And I think that's something that we all prize, because it's not about saying, that's gone, that's history, it's over. History travels with you, and it's traveled with us. But one of the things also, too, is the context of this neighborhood. And you see on the left, you see, the meat packers and the graffiti and a bit of the Highline, and on the right, that's the view looking out into the city. And, this is, again, very different from, in this case, very different from the Breuer building. You're seeing all the layers of New York City in this process, and you're seeing a neighborhood has changed. It's changed radically during the construction process. But you see the brownstones, you see the meatpacking, you see Art Deco buildings, you see modernist buildings, you see contemporary buildings, and those layers are all there, and that sense of the layers and the connections to the city are very much what we come out of. And I love, for example, when somebody, this is a picture that was taken by Renzo's photographer on the left, somebody said that, gee, that doesn't make the building look so great. I actually think it does, because in a way, it really sets the context of what the history of this neighborhood is and where it came from. The other thing that I think is, as I muse on the building, is when I go up into this is a view from the trustee room taken by Jen Leventhal. Excellent picture, Jen. But what I love about this too is that you get the sweep of all of the different kinds of transportation hubs that come out here. The sense that we are at the nexus of things. You have the river, you have the bike path of the Hudson River Park, you have the Highline, you have even the rails of the Highline. So every sense of kind of transportation, of boats going up and down. And you really, as you spend time in the building, you get this sense that somehow we're at the nexus of all these things. And that we're between neighborhoods, we're between Chelsea, and we're between Greenwich Village. And it's that sense that we're a hub of sorts, which is something that I was aware of. But the other thing is, too, is how we're connected to the city of New York. When you walk out onto that 8th floor terrace and you see the Empire State Building to the northeast. And this is actually a film on the right from Warhol's Empire in 1964, which actually is going to be screened. I don't know if that's public yet. I mean, I think it's supposed to be a surprise, but I won't say anything. But we're in the family here, so much for... I know they're saying Adam did it again, so much for that surprise. I know, I'm barely bad at keeping secrets about things I love like this. But anyway, but I'm not going to tell you the other half of it, which is the really best part of the secret. But I'll leave that to Scott and Donna to tell. But these are, the great icons of American art. And here's the great Stedheimer painting, which is promised gift to the, to the collection. And are you having that in your picture too? Sorry, sweetie. But the idea that here is the great Museum of American Art positioned between the Statue of Liberty on one hand, the World Trade Center, and then the Empire State Building. But this is also, too, a neighborhood that is deeply connected to art. You're not showing that, are you?
Yes.
No, I didn't. Nobody told me. Anyway. But anyway, I won't even, I'll keep going. I'm supposed to go faster because I guess I'm taking all the pictures because they didn't tell me what they were doing. But just to mention, these are pieces that are deeply connected to the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Do you have that one?
No, but can we get that painting?
Hunk and Moo Anderson.
Oh, all right, we'll work on that.
Excellent. You don't have this one, do you? I bet you don't. Okay, I'm allowed to talk about this. See, this is what happens when you're all working so fast and you don't coordinate your speeches. My apologies to my colleagues, but I'm letting you make the commentary. But we did have, it was the great Gansevoort painting of de Kooning, which I love. But on the left, Herman Melville, who's one of my heroes. But Gansevoort was actually Herman Melville's brother. It was the maternal grandfather of Herman Melville, and Herman Melville lived on our site. Whether it was directly on our side of Gansevoort, on the other side, it's not clear. But the idea that we're connected to the sense of American history that's there. And then this is actually, I found this, I like this picture. This is the Carpathia that was coming in directly across the street where the Titanic was supposed to arrive. So, this is still a neighborhood. It's a neighborhood that's deeply connected to history. It's deeply connected to art. And there's still a fair number of artists, whether it's Lawrence Weiner, or Jasper Johns, or Julian Schnabel, all of whom have, art has really moved to Brooklyn, it's moved to Queens, it's moved to, but there's still that sense of being connected to the neighborhood. And I'm going to end with these two. I don't know whether you have them in yours. Oh, good, so I didn't put those in again. But, but again, about the idea of connecting to the neighborhood, the hopper on the right, and this is actually a view directly across the street. These are echoes that you find all around the neighborhood. And where was it, Carter, that early Sunday morning was painted? 7th Avenue between 15th.
It actually leads right to it, the old Gansevoort. It's where that spot was.
So Carter's saying that where early Sunday morning was, Gansevoort leads right to, originally led to the spot where early Sunday morning is. So we are in the home, in the cradle of American art history, which I think is really important. And then that whole idea, which we always love, is the idea of looking out into the open spaces, the great open spaces out to New Jersey, but represented by the New Yorker cartoon, which I probably should have put up there. But that sense of being at the nexus between the urban center of the city and the urbanist aspect of the city, and then the great open spaces. But so this is just a few images. I think that was my last one, just to give you a little bit of a framing of some of the things without going through the details of the building. And again, I just want to thank the curators. I think you're next, Donna. So now Donna goes, and I'm looking forward to hearing it all as well as you. And again, thank you for all. Fasten your seatbelts. We're off for quite a ride.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Adam. Well, welcome, everyone. Wow, it's so great. It's like we're back in business. This is good. We all like this. So first of all, I want to thank Catherine Potts for really her idea about all of this, because it's really a wonderful idea to bring everybody together. And Catherine sort of asked me to set this up. The program here, as it unfolds, will be me giving you a bit of an overview, and then my colleagues who I've worked with as part of the core team, Dana Miller, then Carter Foster, and then Scott Rothkopf. So, and as you all know, there'll be training sessions in addition that you'll be going to. So we're going to go into a degree of depth about the sections, but Catherine thought it would be really good for me to talk about sort of how the collection has really inspired many things, from the exhibition that you'll see, but the building itself. Just sort of a little bit of, and those of you who might have been at one of the membership events, forgive me if you're seeing this all over again. But I also want to give a shout out to all my other colleagues, Barbara Haskell, Jay Sanders, Chrissy Isles, David Keel, and Elizabeth Sussman, because this has been a very collaborative process. And if you saw some of us installing in the galleries, we have become now this little organism that somehow moves around and says 2 inches this way, 1/4 inch this way, and somehow it comes out right. So I feel that's like the best team, when you can get all the opinions in there, and then everybody's they're not reasonably happy. We always say the same thing, is it great? And if it's not great, then we go back. So really bravo to all of my colleagues, because we all work to an incredible ideal. And we have the Curator's Director in Adam, who basically leaves us alone for occasional few things when he comes in and says, what happened to that? But it's a great privilege, because that's not the way it is at every other museum. And I've worked at enough other ones that I can say that with great authority. It's been a full court press, so thanks also to colleagues Carol Mancusi-Ungaro, Catherine, as I said, Christy Putnam, and also Jane Panetta, Mia Curran, and Catherine Taft, who came on board to really assist us as well. And this is a huge team effort. So let me just start. Oh, well, you know who I am, so forget about that. I wanted to talk just a little bit, just historically, about the gallery itself and the history of the gallery. And to me, one of the ones I always come to is Frederick Kiesler's Art of the Century. And this was the gallery that Peggy Guggenheim had asked him to design. Kiesler's in our collection. We have the Endless House. You remember the great show that Lisa Phillips did a number of years ago, and this is actually his Surrealist gallery. And what's so interesting about this is if you look, you will see oh, Adam, I'm not doing the laser. Is it right in the middle?
The top little thing.
This one here? Hang on. Oh, thank you. Okay, Grant. That's why he's the director. Okay, and so you see the little arms that the work juts out on. And there was actually a kinetic gallery where the works actually moved. And I think this whole idea of what we expect now from a gallery, what happens in it, and you go back to Liszewski and his Prown Room at the early part of the 20th century, and the work of art as space, this is Scott's favorite topic, then we go back to our own history. And, this is the thing, you work with what you know, and many of us have worked in various different organizations and had these levels of experience. So, of course, you have Richard Serra here on this side, and then Raphael Ferrer. This was from the major anti-illusion show. So we've been thinking about that. These are all the cumulative experiences over time. I can talk from my own history. This is the Turbine Hall project that I curated with Anish Kapoor at the Tate Modern, and his idea was to take on the whole Turbine Hall. He really wanted to move against what Louise Bourgeois had done, which was to be one side. Another artist was the other side, and artists are like one-upsmanship, and so he said, I'm taking over the whole side. So, but all of this idea of this gallery as space, I think, is very fundamental. So Renzo Piano, of course, the great architect, because one of the things I think that we all prize in Renzo's work is this capacity to create very intimate kind of spaces, and probably the most emblematic of that is the Menil collection. And you see these beautiful skylit galleries, the intimacy of it, but also the understanding of a gallery and a museum as a civic space. And of course, in the Pompidou that he did, that's very much the case. And I think our Largo, our outdoor spaces, and we have great chairs that are going in with colors we hope are right, because we chose them, but that will activate that. And there's so much asked of a museum today. It's a really interesting question. What is a museum? Is it a social space? Is it a space to see art? Is it a space to pick up people, meet your husband, meet your wife, meet your whatever? It's like so many demands on the space, and my great colleague Adrian Hardwick, who's here now, who we work together at Tate, is dealing a lot with the visitor experience of that. And then the views that Adam spoke of, and this is the Byler Foundation, where you really have the view. Here you have a few cows and some grass, but it's always about framing an inside-outside world. So I wanted to talk about how the collection influenced the design of the galleries, because the one constant you have in any museum, which is what I love about working with a collection, is that it's a constant. Temporary exhibitions come and go. You negotiate the loans, they're there for 3 months. If the show travels, maybe you see it again. But generally speaking, for those of us who've installed works maybe multiple times, you learn it each time. So we actually, this is Adam and I a few years ago. We look a little different. Adam, you look good. I don't know about me, but whatever. There we are in Genoa with Renzo, talking about the general, Adam still had his beard then, talking about the general layout. And one thing I wanted to share was that I asked my colleagues to give me images of works in the collection that represented different sense of space and scale. And we actually sat with Renzo and went through that. His language is architecture. Our language is art. And once we established that, I think it's why we've had a very respectful working relationship over time. So, of course, there's the intimacy of the circus. I think it's the work that maybe most one thinks about in sort of these very miniature little worlds, the delicacy of the wire, but then also the expansiveness of the Rothko, and simultaneously the idea of the nature of other materials. So this is an extraordinary work come into the collection by Mary Ellen Butte, a very beautiful abstract film, and we want to see it in film, if we can see it in film because of the materiality of film. So, and then of course dance. Jay gave me the slide. I wouldn't have expected anything else, anything less than that from Jay Sanders. I don't know. Jay is, I think he's the one with the hatchet, but I'm not sure. But the idea, and I think everyone knows from how we've used the Breuer building over time, that we can turn the 4th floor into a gallery or into a dance space. So this fluidity, of the space is a really important thing. And this is something we did when we actually tested out, I don't know if you remember this one, but we literally went to the Armory up on 68th Street to test out what would be the footprint of the gallery so that we could really get a sense of the proportion, how they worked. And this is all of what's gone into the thinking of things. And then there are the lessons from Breuer, which I think, Adam alluded to. And, this was from the Full House show that many of you might remember that Dana Carter and Barbara and I did. Almost kind of our first America is Hard to See, so to speak, because we worked as a team on that. And of course, looking at the breadth of these floor plates, what is possible in a space that doesn't have any columns. I mean, yes, there are columns in there, but you don't see them, and the back galleries drop down. The ceiling, which was, I think, very influential for all of us, not just Renzo, but really all of us, what it provided. And then here we are actually doing the test of the mock-up that was designed. First one was in Harlem, and then one was in Red Hook. And we really tested out all these different decisions. You make this full-sized mock-up, which is quite amazing, actually, when you go and visit. And it was reassuring to know you didn't have to make a decision based on a little tiny model, like we generally do when we're laying out shows. One of the things Adam and I probably spent the most time on, and with all our colleagues, was looking at ceiling heights, because it's probably the biggest decision you have to make, is getting right the size of the space. And this is actually these are most of the places that we went. And people were very generous in letting us go into their spaces and measure ceiling heights and test them out and really think about what works, what doesn't work. Do you build for a work that doesn't exist? Do you build for works that already exist but are earlier in the century? It's how do you come up with something that has flexibility but not anonymity? That's like the key thing. It has to have character. Otherwise, you have nothing. And so this was probably, I think, one of the things we sweated over. I think, and I feel we got it right. I'm very confident about that. So The other thing was really looking at the works themselves. Like, what's going on in all of these works at different moments in the history of art? So, of course, this is our great prop piece by Richard Serra, and the idea of really looking at the relationship between the wall and the floor, and then what the requirements of that kind of a work are. Or this is Kara Walker's piece, Mistress Demanded Swift and Dramatic Emphatic Reaction, which we obliged her. And a work like this encompasses. Now, what I'm showing you here is not about necessarily the exhibition per se, and my colleagues will speak to that, but it's the fact that we thought about the works themselves. You know, in a way, it's like, who's going to live in this house? And the principal occupant, first and foremost, are the works of art. Then curators, then all of us and the public. So we kind of build from that way out. Or our Linda Benglis Contraband, some of you may remember. Here's the floor becomes the space of the exhibition. So then that influences how you think about the floor itself. So there's our mock-up with various different tests that we made. And the floor itself, and now you'll see the real floor in the building as it is now. But this is something we did out actually in Red Hook, working with John, Stanley, Larissa Gentile, the whole team from Cooper Robertson Piano Workshop, and Christy Putnam let us bring real works out there. And one of the things we had to talk a lot about was some of the details. And I'm pointing these things out because as you're going through the building now, you're going to talk about the exhibition, but you're also going to see these things. And then it's really the holistic aspect of the artist's museum. What do we really mean by that? And it's in these details that I think we actually bring to life what that phrase really means. So the reveal was something we spent a lot of time, which is the wall and the wall and the floor. And I know this seems like a small thing, but those of us who sweated it out, we really had a lot of conversation. So for instance, here's the Richard Serra. Bottom is with a reveal. Top is without a reveal. And you put the reveal in really to create a good line in the construction. Some architects use it as a kind of device. So we tested it out, and what we did, whoops, not with them, what we did was we brought our Cara Andre piece, 7th Copper Cardinal, out, 7th? 29th, excuse me, I shortchanged him. 29th Copper.
22.
Maybe we just bring 7. So there you see literally, okay, there's an 1/8, which is no reveal, 3/8, which is a tiny reveal, and 5/8, which is a major reveal. What does it do to the work of art, the experience of the object, the integrity of the object? This is a lot of back and forth. This is where Renzo was really extraordinary because rightly so, we did not want to have a messy edge. We wanted fine building, but he also was willing to not go there, and this is what you will see. And it will always make a difference when any work of art is installed. So who do we represent in that? Obviously, the artists and their voice. So I think that's what we mean. We're the advocate for the artists, and the works are kind of stand-ins for the artists themselves. So then that gets us to the building that we now have today. You all know the cross-section. And, you know, Catherine thought it would be useful also to talk a little bit about the galleries themselves and the characteristics. So our 8th floor, as you know, and as the show is organized chronologically, and we'll talk more about that, you know, you're going to go through the building. So the 8th floor, the Hearst Family Galleries, is actually our only top-lit gallery. And I love this because this is the Dulwich Picture Gallery in Dulwich, South London, which is...
changed the installations.
Oh yeah. We changed the wall color and everything. But it's the world's first purpose-built public gallery, built in 1811. And you see, of course, the top light, which is a very, very strong thing you see in a lot of historical museums. But then you jump from that to something like Dia Beacon. And in effect, actually, we asked Renzo to go up to Dia Beacon because we really quite like the simplicity of the sawtooth design. This was a former Nabisco printing plant, was built in 1929, and then Dia opened it in 2003, worked with Robert Irwin, the artist, actually on they did very little, but actually that's the brilliance, is you really don't see the intrusions of it. And then there is our galleries. All right, and this is where we have a little duplication. Our great 5th floor space, of course, Gordon Matta Clark's Days End, which, as you see, was installed. Now, I don't know, is this right, Scott?
Yes.
Okay.
That's correct.
Okay, we had a lot of back and forth.
Scott
Okay,
is right.
so there it is. See, I'm pointing to it there. So, but this was at Gansevoort. But again, that idea of these contemporary artists working this way, or our Robert Irwin that you saw, and of course the galleries there. And then, of course, we have our outdoor galleries. And I always This is the one I always think a lot about, is the Trisha Brown roof dance piece, the idea of this, the top of the roof as a sort of urban stage, and the idea of what's possible. And this is where the program has driven so much of the design of the building. But this was interesting. If those of you who remember this, because I was not at the Whitney at that time, but it was an incredible thing to see the Paul McCarthy leashed to the top of the Breuer building. And it's where we started first to think about the building as pedestal. And in the original design for Uptown, we were constructing outdoor galleries. So it's really interesting. It was a test run, as you said earlier. And of course, there are our great outdoor galleries that we'll have, and this is where we have a little duplication, but you can never get too much of a slide like that. So collaborating with Renzo Piano and the core team. So, you know, I think as many of you know, we've engaged in a really unprecedented analysis of the collection through our collection documentation initiative, conservation analysis. We really have gone through this collection in, I think, a way it probably had never quite happened before, because we had the opportunity to do so. And this is where we mostly spent our time. That's the core team working with all of our little individual cutouts there, to go through the collection first. We really didn't know what it was we were doing. In a funny way. We really began from a kind of amorphous thing of what's here. We went decade by decade. We looked at the works. We thought about isms. We worked about it. We really did start from that place. And then I think over time, we began, all of us started to look at certain strands in the collection, preoccupations, strengths of the collection, things that map to the exhibition history of the Whitney. And it was really from that place that we then started to get to what it was that we wanted this exhibition to be. And I must say, there were moments I really just was not sure myself. I had every confidence, but I think it's great when you begin from a place of the unknown, because that's when things are open to you. You don't come from a preconceived place. And it was from that we really started to extract what this show would be. We also spoke with Renzo a lot, because we wanted to show his building off. And there we are, actually at old 290 there, you know, looking at how we would construct the walls, because it's not just these floor plates now, it's how we build the walls and articulate the space. And I think that this is where we also worked very, very closely, all the curators together, and we asked the architects their advice. And we think that's Dana's hand, you know, measuring, because there's a level. We haven't figured out whose hand this is here, but a level of precision. And I must thank Scott, who always kept us on track about the ceiling grid. And you know, we're working with a completely new building that we've never worked in before. So a little just backstory. You know, here we are making our maquettes, testing out what would those outdoor sculptures look like. These are the maquettes for the David Smiths, Robert Morris. And then we had an 11th hour moment of finally coming to what this show was, and then what are we going to call it? And this was a lot of brainstorming. We had a lot of different ideas on the table. And the one we came up with, which you all know, is called America is Hard to See. It comes from two sources. One is, and we use it metaphorically, not literally. One was from Robert Frost, and a poem that he published for the first time in the Atlantic in 1951. And at that time he called it "And All We Call American." And then it was subsequently published later on. I'm just reading you one little stanza. America is hard to see, less partial witnesses than he, in book on book have testified they could not see it from outside, or inside either, for that matter, we know the literary chatter. So the idea of, you know, what is America, and our job, which is to problematize American art, to break down American art as some monolithic thing that represents just one thing. We'd never be the Artist Museum if that's what we believed, because we represent many individual positions in this way. And so this was one source. The 1968 America is Hard to See is a film by the political filmmaker Emile D'Antonio. You can actually find it on YouTube. It was a film that he made about Eugene McCarthy's failed bid for the presidential nomination, which then went to Bobby Kennedy, a very tragic time in American history. this is not to suggest anything dark. It suggests actually the strength, the willingness of the U.S. as idea, which Paul Chan always says America is an idea, and what Adam said earlier, even speaking about what Flora said, but how we look at this in a very, very elastic way. So the exhibition is organized by various chapters, and these are the section titles. Each one of these titles actually is a work of art, and Carter and Scott are going to speak about selections from those. So that really sets up things. And then in conjunction with this is a project that we've been doing, Scott in particular has been spearheading. We talked a lot about, we have only one commission that's permanent in the building, which is the Richard Archwager elevators. But we wanted to talk about how to activate the maintenance and operation roof of the Highline. And the person we thought to reach out to, who kind of has a good laid back but serious attitude, was Mary Heilman. And so we've approached her to do something on the roof, which involves a series of chairs for people to kind of hang out, have some sense of agency, a little relaxation, if you will. And there's actually a model this is a proposal, and this is what she's been working through. So we hope all of this, we're still working down to the wire on all of this, but I think it would give people a great sense of pleasure to be in a space like that, and possibly this is what it would look like from afar. And then there's Mary. And that's the part of what we do that we really enjoy so much. So that kind of gives you some background of how we got to America is Hard to See. And, and now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dana Miller, who you all know, who has been working for a long time with the collection and is our great steward of the collection, level of detail and knowledge and commitment to the collection that is really extraordinary, unparalleled. And Dana has been very involved and really been the driver behind an acquisitions initiative, which she's going to speak a bit about, and also the new permanent collection handbook, which I can say is stunning. So Dana, I hand it over to you.
And can you hear me? Yeah? Yes, everybody back there? Okay, great. And I have a head cold, so I can't hear you at all. So if there's any interruptions or questions, just let me know. So moving on, as Donna said, I'm going to speak to you first about an acquisition initiative. So this research project has been something along the lines of the 3-year project. And we understood that we had 3 years really to think about the most strategic way to approach our acquisitions. Were there works that we felt really compelled to bring into the collection that would help tell the narrative that we were evolving, or that would push the narrative in certain directions that we wanted it to grow? And in some cases, would these works test the narratives that we were thinking about? So we did this in-depth analysis of the collection, as Donna said, and we worked with all of our curators across the departments, but we also were cognizant of certain blind spots that we might have, and perhaps the lack of diversity amongst our core team group. And so we reached out to colleagues in the field who had complementary areas of expertise, in particular 3 of them. Now, Thelma Golden, many of you know, is a former Whitney employee, so she's kind of like family, and she can come in and tell us exactly what she thinks about the collection, the highs, the lows, where we sort of, let the fish get away, all of that. But she really did light a fire under us and kind of galvanize this effort in some respects, and, reminded us that we do need to reach out to our colleagues and figure out what it is that we don't know. So we also reached out to Alexandra Cheng and Rita Gonzalez, and they both came in the spring of 2013, spent a day with us. They assessed the collection, they gave us reports, things that they thought were highlights that we agreed we've been giving lots of attention to, things that we had been neglecting but they felt were very strong works, things that they suggested as first targets to go after in terms of adding things to the collection. It was a really interesting and productive conversation. And Rita we picked specifically because she's West Coast based, and most of the Hispanic artists in our collection are East Coast specific. They've come up from Puerto Rico or Cuba, and with Rita we were looking at a different demographic pattern. So the good news is they were raving about many of the things in our collection that we will be showing in the inaugural presentation. Just a couple of them to show you. Kuniyoshi, who's such an important figure in the early years of the Whitney, and this is a major piece that the Smithsonian Museum, which is doing a Kunioshi monographic, is brokenhearted that we didn't lend, but we felt it was so important to have in our early display here. William H. Johnson, we almost placed this piece this afternoon. It's really such a pleasure to see them in the flesh. Marisol, which we placed yesterday. It's another highlight of the 60s pop era, and Al Loving's painting. So all of these works are in the show, and you will see them, but there were many other highlights that they pointed out. But then what we looked at more specifically and spent the most amount of time was thinking about what we could do with the limited time and money we had to acquire works in the 18 months or so. And we came up with a list of targets, and we worked with all of our curators and with the full support of our acquisition committee. So I really just want to, this is the second shout out to all of the other curators, but really our deep thanks to the acquisition committees who devoted a good portion of their monies towards this endeavor. And I'm just going to show you a handful of things that we've acquired in the last 18 months. All of these artists are included in this inaugural show. Some of these works are included. In some cases, I'm showing you more than we had room. So Chiro Obata, he's a Japanese-born American artist. He came to this country after early training in sumi ink brush techniques and fell in with a group of artists and professors in the Bay Area outside of San Francisco and had a formative experience when he went hiking through Yosemite Valley in 1927. His father passed away, and he took hundreds of watercolors he made on that trip back to Tokyo and then worked with craftsmen, traditional craftsmen, making a series of woodblock prints that took 18 months to create. And each one of these prints required more than 100 impressions, some of them more than 200. So when you get up close, they really defy what a woodblock print can be, because you can see the individual brush strokes from the hairs, the hairs from each paint stroke when the original watercolor was conceived. We reached out to the Obata family. The print committee, David's committee, bought one of them, and then his son, Gyo Obata, gave us the other 17. And it was deeply meaningful to him to have these works in the Whitney Museum of American Art. They are in other collections, mostly on the West Coast, and he says they're often seen in the Asian art wings, and it's something that he's wanted to remedy. Okay, Toyo Miyatake, another Japanese-born American artist who established a photo studio in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. These are early works that he was taking in collaboration with Michio Ito, who was a modern dancer, also Japanese-born, but working in Los Angeles. But obviously exploring with sort of modernist techniques. He and Weston were quite close, and he's actually credited with giving Weston his first showing. Miyatake, like 10,000 other Japanese-born immigrants in this country, was placed in an internment camp during World War II. He smuggled in parts of a camera, which he put together and took photos from the inside of the internment camp. He was found out, and the director of the camp then gave him a better camera and permission to shoot. So they're really poignant counterpoints to the photos that we all know from Ansel Adams and Dorothea Lange from the outside of the camps. Elizabeth Catlett. So this is the first piece we acquired. Some of you have seen this already as part of this initiative. It was a purchase and fund of, in memory of our beloved guard, Cecil Weeks. This is the first Catlett sculpture that we've acquired. We had prints from the same year and related to this painting, a print series called I Am Negro Woman. But Catlett graduated with an MFA from the University of Iowa and studied under Grant Wood, and he told her to render what you know. And so most of her work is approaching sort of this archetypal female figure, usually African American, but one is sort of the paradigm of dignity and sort of human potential. There she is working on the sculpture on the left, and then our sculpture on the cover of a monograph. Roy de Carava, who was already in the collection, but whom Elizabeth felt was sort of a paragon of mid-century photography. And I don't know if Elizabeth's here or not, but in any case, we acquired 3 more. Again, we went to the family, and in this case, 2 works were purchased, and his widow donated a third. The one on the far left is from The Sweet Flypaper of Life, which is a book he collaborated on with Langston Hughes, and it's images of everyday life in his Harlem neighborhood. And then I love the one in the middle. It's Elvin Jones, the jazz drummer, and you can't see it in reproduction, but the bottom left corner, you can just make out a half circle, which is a symbol. So he's in the midst of a session right there. Carmen Herrera, a Cuban-born American artist. She's turning 100 years old this spring. I think some of you may know that I'm going to be making a small monographic presentation of her work in fall of 2016. But this is something we also worked on with Carmen. She felt very strongly that the work that came into the museum, her first work, would be one of her strongest. And so this is the earliest work from her most important series, the Blanco y Verde series that she worked on intermittently throughout her career. Carmen married an American and lived here in New York and then in Paris. She established this very sort of hard edge style, this very diluted palette when she was in Paris right at the same time as Ellsworth Kelly. So they both came back from Europe with very similar styles, although they never crossed paths. And Carmen says that she hung out with the artists and Ellsworth hung out with the musicians. So Anquara, someone else, surprisingly not in our collection until last year. And we were lucky enough to begin this endeavor before he passed away. So Scott had reached out to him in the gallery, and he had made available certain works for us to acquire for the museum. And we went back and forth and with the Painting and Sculpture Committee to figure out which one was the right one. And of course, this date had particular appeal for us. I'm sure many of you have seen the show at the Guggenheim, but the Today series, each work is made during the course of one day, and if it's not finished before the end of the day, he discards it. But each work also is housed in a handmade box, most of which are lined with newspapers from the town, the front page newspaper of the town in which he made it. So here you see the New York Daily News, and it's a headline about Jane Mansfield's funeral and President Johnson meeting his grandson. And then my poor photograph at the bottom, you see that the subtitle for this work is called Independence Day. Faith Ringgold, also not in the collection. She spent a good portion of the late 60s and early 70s boycotting and picketing the Whitney in MoMA. Carter found this really wonderful collage that's a study for a poster that's protesting the imprisonment of Angela Davis, who was a civil rights activist in the West Coast and accused of aiding and abetting with a kidnapping and murder, and eventually freed of all charges. But this is a transitional period before she moves to her quilts, and I think Carter was really smart to locate these works. ASCO, Chicano collective active in South Central Los Angeles. We bought 8 of these works through Photo Committee. Jay might be in this one too. Yeah, there's the hatchet. So in any case, this is a collective, and they were responding to the lack of Chicano actors and workers in the Hollywood industry in Los Angeles at that moment, and at the same time to the pejorative, stereotypical images of Chicano in the mass media. So they didn't have enough money to make films. They couldn't actually buy films, so they made all of the apparatus associated with film. So the film stills, the posters, the press releases. This is several years before Cindy Sherman. And they called them the no movies. So they're pieces that are related to movies that never existed. This one is called The Gores, and one critic described them as Ziggy Stardust meets Mexicana. This is another important piece where they had one of their members lie down in the middle of the street as if he had been killed by a gang war, and then they put up all of these traffic flares, and they disseminated this image to news media outlets, and many of them reported on this as if it was a real event. So again, they're kind of assessing and I think provoking the various apparatus of dissemination of images and stereotypes. It was on the cover of Art Forum when the Pacific Standard Time show was reviewed. And then one last example is Ayoko Chinzira is one of many works that Chrissy Isles has brought in through Film and Video Committee, a number of time-based works. She's been looking at artists of Middle Eastern descent as well as African Americans, and Ayoko Chinzira is considered one of the first African American women to write, direct, and produce her own 35 millimeter feature film. This piece is a highly influential piece that she made in '84. It was actually shown as part of a program at the Whitney Museum, and it uses a combination of animation, line drawing, cinematic film, and soundtrack to kind of satirize the surfeit of devices geared towards African American women and their hair care. So in any case, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are many, well, maybe I shouldn't say iceberg, a very nice iceberg that we'd like to grow, but that's just a sampling of some of the things that we've been bringing in. There are others that will be included in the inaugural show, and then I don't believe that this initiative is really ending when the museum opens. I think we're going to continue this maybe on not such an intensive basis, but I think it's been deeply rewarding and something we want to keep on the front of our minds. Some of the works that are not in the inaugural show may appear in the new permanent collection handbook. So just to give you a quick overview, the Whitney, as do most museums, from time to time produces a catalog of the collection. It used to be comprehensive. Now, of course, it's selections. The last one we did was in 2001, which you see at the bottom on the right. And we are about to produce one now on the occasion of the new building. So this is a very rough mock-up of the cover. It looks much more beautiful. Our design department, Hillary Greenbaum, did a very lovely job of it. And it's quite different than the last handbook. This one has 350 artists as opposed to 282, so it's substantially larger. The way that we pick the artists and the objects is complicated. We have to have a range of chronologies, a range of media. We're thinking about how many living artists. We're thinking about the age of the artist, women, artists of color, how will the works actually reproduce on the page? It's quite complicated, but there were certain figures that we did want to sort of improve upon from the last one, namely the 22% women and the 11% artists of color. We didn't have a quota. There was no target number that we were trying to reach. We just wanted to get to a place that we were more comfortable with. And I should point out at the bottom, 214 works in this publication are on the checklist. So this is not a catalog that accompanies the inaugural show. You know, it's something separate. It's meant to have a shelf life of about 10 years. So there is overlap, but it is by no means a catalog to the exhibition. And another thing to think about is that when we were making the selections for the handbook, we were aware that the entirety of the collection would be online. So if you don't know this already, the whole collection went online on January and is available at whitney.org. So I think that emboldened us a little bit with our choices, that maybe we felt we could go beyond some of the usual suspects if we knew someone searching for Hopper or O'Keeffe would know where to go and be able to find them. And so here's a spread. This is the opening spread for Georgia O'Keeffe. Some artists get more than one page, some of them the usual suspects, some, others we tried to spice it up a little bit. But I want to point out that you see both the birth and death dates for Georgia O'Keeffe, but also the birth and death place. And that's a small but important detail. We've never included the birth and death place for our artists. And we're going to do so for the labels, and we're doing so for the handbook. And this is a small but significant shift for us, because we're acknowledging that even though we're the Whitney Museum of American Art, American artists come from so many different places. And it's a much more nuanced understanding, we think, of what it means to be an American artist. So you see how some of the old and familiar works get mixed up. And it's arranged entirely alphabetically, so all of the spreads are serendipitous. What happens across a spread is entirely unplanned, and some of them are, I promise. This does happen to be one of my favorites. And then we decided we were going to end fittingly, I think, with one of the last works that we acquired that happens to be called Andrea Zattel A to Z. So that's the last work in the collection. But just a point about the birth and death places. When we did the numbers, what we found is that more than 70 of the artists out of the 350 were born outside of the United States. And so that discussion informed a little bit the foreword that is included in this book that I wrote, defining American, and looking more deeply at as how the Whitney has historically interpreted the term American, because it's expanded and contracted throughout its history. It hasn't been a very fixed interpretation. And the corollary questions, can only an American make American art? And by what criteria is an artist American? So I delve into that a little bit. And then Adam has a much lengthier and beautiful essay going across the entire history of the collection, and starting with Gertrude and the notion of an artist museum founded by an artist for an artist, and what that means for the Whitney, what it has meant historically, and what it means for us today. So I think those are two, nice pieces of background reading, but those two projects in and of themselves have come out of the work that the core team has been doing on the inaugural show, and I think in turn have informed the checklist and the presentation in the inaugural show. And I think with that, we get on to the inaugural show.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Is that good? Yeah? So I'm here to talk about the sections in our America is Hard to See. I'm not going to talk about every one. You can get a full list of them. And as Dana said, we made this decision to title each section after a work of art in that section. The first section is in the lobby gallery, and it's called 8 West 8th, after this series of watercolors that we found in the course of our research by Guy Pendubois that, believe it or not, weren't even accessioned, even though they had been commissioned by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney and Juliana Force as a documentation of life at the Studio Club. And so here you see the sort of title piece with Gertrude as a sort of puppet master, very humorously done. And then, of course, our two great founding ladies, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney by Robert Henry, and this beautiful small portrait by Guy Pendubois of Juliana Force at the Whitney Studio Club. This will open the lobby gallery. You'll see it through those glass doors. It's already up. It looks amazing. Of course, this is also a nod to the Ashcan School moment, the beginnings sort of American modernism in many ways, and a shift in American art that Gertrude supported by buying 4 paintings out of the famous 8 exhibition. Many of those artists will be on view as well. And then this painting in some ways about spectatorship, so it's also a great way to open. What's, I think, wonderful about this painting is that Guy Pendubois signed it in the painting that she's looking at. So she's actually looking at a Guy Pendubois painting in the painting. That's the nice little conceptual nod. And then here's an example of another one of those watercolors by Guy Pendubois showing the sculptor. This is the sculptor Joe Davidson. They would have these certain activities at the Studio Club, which is very much about a social space, a space for artists to create work. They would have parties and contests where artists would paint portraits and do things. They also had life class significantly for a number of years, and Mabel Dwight made a wonderful depiction of that life class, which will be in the show, but Hopper himself made over 600 drawings that we own in life class at the Studio Club, so we are going to show a range of them. Here's a section, a selection of them. Going to put them up in a kind of salon style, so it's a nod to the activities of the Studio Club, the art made there, and the people who created it. The next section is called Forms Abstracted, after this beautiful Marsden Hartley painting from 1913. Hartley working in Berlin. Hartley really one of the most original American artists who took on a kind of post-Cubist aesthetic. And that's really what this section is about. It's about artists kind of working in the wake of the innovations of European modernism, post-Cubism, but artists taking that a step forward. And certainly Hartley is one of those artists who did that. Perhaps one of his most celebrated paintings, painting number 5, an homage to Karl von Freiberg, a German officer that he knew in Berlin. And he truly is one of the most original American artists dealing and finding a new way to deal with the language of breaking down recognizable form, dealing with signs and symbols. This is the 8th floor. Yeah, sorry, I should be saying the floor. This is this is the 8th floor. So we're starting on 8 and going down. So and there's 3 sections on 8. So that this again is in Forms Abstracted. A sort of a section that developed as a kind of subsection of Forms Abstracted early on in our planning was this idea of synesthesia, which is a powerful metaphor for many people at the beginning of the century to deal with abstraction, to deal with a visual language that wasn't representational. And synesthesia just means when your senses get switched, so you can see colors as sound, things like that. And Georgia O'Keeffe in her amazing painting, Music Pink and Blue #2, is making a direct allusion to that concept. And that it will be the title of that section, Music Pink and Blue. So that's also on the 8th floor. Also in Forms Abstracted, a couple of beautiful wood sculptures. One of my favorite discoveries in our research into the collection was this beautiful head of a Maasai warrior by Nancy Elizabeth Prophet, an African-American artist who worked in Paris and also back in America. This is actually one of her most famous pieces. We saw it in stores recently. It's so incredibly beautiful from every angle. It has a wonderful tension between finished and unfinished, and it is a modern form, even though it's representational. It's meant as a type, and it's got a very streamlined, refined approach to the way it sort of delivers the figure to you. We're thinking about, we haven't installed this floor yet, but I've always thought about comparing it to this wonderful Flame by Robert Lauren, who's also an artist who worked representationally, but this is also really something that teeters on the edge of abstraction and figuration. It's a representation of a flame. He also worked beautifully in wood. So that's the modern form section. Then the third section on the 8th floor is titled after this Louis Lazowick, beautiful Louis Lazowick drawing, Machine Ornament. Louis Lazowick, a really important figure for the spread of the interest in an industrial aesthetic. And so this floor will sort of contain classic examples of what we call what's known as precisionism. Some of our most iconic paintings are incredible. Charles Demuth, My Egypt, which definitely takes on the kind of refracting multiple planes of cubism and retranslates them in an American way, sort of presenting a grain elevator in Lancaster, Pennsylvania as a kind of Egyptian temple, making a direct comparison. And then Elsie Driggs also elevating the industrial to some kind of mythic proportions with her incredible painting of a factory in Pittsburgh. And then also we're going to mix it up a little bit with, and I should say something we tried very hard to do throughout our work on this opening display was to mix mediums. We're not breaking down mediums into any kind of any hierarchical way. Sometimes we have to show works on paper together just because of light issues and how they get displayed, but they're very much integrated into the entire display, and we felt very strongly about that. And that's what we're going to do here when we show this great photograph of a dam by Margaret Bourke-White and Man Ray's famous sort of representation of New York, both humorous and very serious in the way he takes found objects and puts them together with a nod to the sort of skyscraper architecture. And New York as a city being so important in sort of the development of a machine age aesthetic. Breaking the Prairie, this is a section that takes its title from this wonderful Grant Wood drawing, which we don't have on view that often because it's a work on paper, but it's a monumental or a fairly large-sized drawing, study for a mural still in Iowa. And this is the idea of taking the mythology and the mythic and the narratives of America. I always thought of this section as a way, the way artists turned America into history paintings. We come out of an academic tradition of the 19th century and into the 20th century, and you get a breakdown of sort of hierarchies of genres of painting, but artists turn to sort of methods of European history painters almost to deliver stories about America, and that's really what this section is about. And I think you can see that very clearly in a work by Grant Wood, who was deeply interested in Northern Renaissance painting and the clarity of light and the rendering of forms, using that to give mythic qualities to this quintessentially American story of expanding westward. Get more of that in John Stewart Curry's Baptism in Kansas. I'm sorry, so now we're down on the 7th floor, yes. Sorry, I'm good about all that. So down on the 7th floor, John Stewart Curry's Baptism in Kansas, also a sort of a grand narrative of something that goes on in America. And then James Castle, an amazing artist who worked in isolation in some ways, but not in isolation from culture, but in isolation from other artists. A self-taught artist working in Idaho in the first part of the 20th century who made incredible, beautifully subtle, wonderful renderings of the places that he lived out west in America. And then one part of this section is really about archetypes and about sort of taking sort of figures that are almost like stock characters in American history and presenting them in a very heroic way. And I think something we're proud of is that, and this has become very trendy these days, but mixing sort of the self-taught, which is a very problematic term, I think, and so-called folk art with other art. I feel that we've found a way to do this really well in this gallery, and I'm really proud of how this actually turned out. These works are actually hanging next to each other. And what's amazing is that Bill Traylor, who was a person who was a former slave who made art only the last few years of his life, but came up with this incredibly original graphic style depicting anonymous figures. He stands up absolutely to all the other figures in this gallery, so I think we're excited about that. The Circus is the title of a section that's also on the 7th floor. We just started installing it today. And this really came out of this idea that I believe Donna had about, what does it mean to look at the circus and look at people looking at the circus, and this idea of spectatorship and other ideas that had surfaced while we were working on doing research for this show had to do with sort of the urban spectacle and the idea of the city as a place of voyeurism, as a place of looking. So we actually decided to sort of combine these two sections to create this section called the Circus. So along with Calder's Circus, you'll see probably as a bit of a surprise, Reginald Marsh's 10 Cents a Dance, which is also a very confrontational piece, but very much about spectacle and voyeurism. It makes a great pairing with this Ouija photograph, who basically took the idea of sensationalist activities in the city and recording them, and both caricaturing and kind of recording the activities that go on in city life. And this is my favorite comparison. A wonderful printmaker named Mabel Dwight, who we have in great depth, did this very humorous depiction of people in an urban environment looking at an aquarium, and she made the fish. It's a black and white lithograph, except she picks out the color of the fish in orange. So she's creating something that's about the act of looking, as looking at a work of art is. And of course, I always think of Edward Hopper's Nighthawks as like an urban aquarium. It's like you're looking into this aquarium at figures at night. So the people are the fish. And then there's a section about that precedes going into abstract expressionism that takes its title from this wonderful series of prints, which David Keel acquired fairly recently by Hugo Geller. And this particular part of this wonderful portfolio of brightly colored graphic images is called Fighting with All Our Might. The whole portfolio is an illustration of a speech that was given by the Secretary of State under Roosevelt, Henry Wallace. And so we'll show multiple images of these, but they make a really strong graphic counterpoint about the war, and then along with them, we'll show a selection from Jacob Lawrence's great war series, which you all know very well. But I think it'll be a really interesting tension to show works that were made with very different ideas, very different intents together that both deal with World War II. And then something that very much came out of our research into the collection was an interest in the politics of the 1930s, the time of great upheaval in America. There were, and we found in doing our research that there were quite a number of prints that depicted lynching because there was an anti-lynching bill up before Congress in 1935, I believe, that actually didn't pass, believe it or not. Passed late in the next decade. But many artists made, both African American and Caucasian, made prints dealing with this subject. One of the most famous is Harry Sternberg's very disturbing Southern Holiday. And then, so that's we have actually a whole section of prints on lynching. And then there's a section about sort of labor movements and strikes and workers. And we have this great painting by Alice Neal, Pat Whalen, depicting a union activist with these incredibly strong hands that really look ready to fight. So it's really good in this section. Finally, for my part, we end on this floor, the 7th floor, with abstract expressionism, or what you think of as that great flowering of New York painting in the 50s. We had another discovery was this wonderful painting by Hedda Stern. She was the only woman in the famous photograph made of the Irascibles. And we love this painting in storage. It feels so fresh to us. It's done in spray paint. Obviously, it's an allusion to the girders and the building of New York, but also quite abstract. So that gives the name to this section. We wanted to give real estate to works of art that hadn't been shown in a while. Lee Krasner really came to be, and this great painting that we have by her from 1957, The Seasons, exuberant, beautiful, celebratory, even though it was made after her husband died. It's that really celebrates, that dominates the floor. Maybe she was happy and freed. I don't know. And then, of course, Mark Rothko's great Four Dogs in Red, which you all know. This really forms a killer wall of paintings. This is a room that I would say is heavy on masterpieces. So Willem de Kooning's Woman and Bicycle, which actually opens the section, and Franz Klein's, this is really Franz Klein's greatest painting. They, of course, knew each other and had parallel ways of working. So that ends my part. And I'll give it over to Scott. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the 6th and the 5th floors. And so here we are on the 6th floor. But maybe before I do, I want to just say just a couple of more general framing devices about the way the show's organized in the building for those of you who are giving tours, because we might have kind of elided some of that. There are, as we mentioned, these different chapters, and I believe there are 24 of them. Mia, is that correct, the right number now? She's nodding. We just added one last week. And those 24 chapters exist on the floors that we've been discussing, 8, 7, and now onto 6 and 5, as well as in the Kaufman Gallery and the Lobby Gallery, where you'll find the Studio Club. They are, as we mentioned, arranged chronologically from the top to the bottom, not counting the Studio Club, which is the beginning in the lobby. But when you get on each floor, you're going to maybe wonder a little bit how you want to move through the floor, if people ask you which way do they go when they get off the elevator. And we purposefully left open a kind of porous architectural structure so that you could kind of go left, right, front, center, however you want. except that for the 7th and 6th and 5th floors, the show basically goes in chronological order from west to east. So if you start near the windows looking over the river, you'll be mostly with the earliest works on that floor, and then as you move to the east, towards the city side, you'll end up with the most recent works on that floor. So for those of you who are giving tours or showing people around, that's a kind of useful orientation. But if they ask, we don't have a prescribed route, but that kind of gives you a sense of the framing. And then the other two things I wanted to mention just about the way that the show exists in the building, in addition to the outdoor terraces, which I'll talk about, is that in our great new theater, as you know, we never had a theater before, and now we have one, we will be doing a series of film screenings on the weekends, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, which are all drawn from our collection. And this is really a wonderful opportunity for us to show films as part of this exhibition that are organized into kind of thematic clusters, and there'll be more information about that on our website, but if any of you ask, we really consider them part of the collection. We're only screening things that we own and that are part of this exhibition. And as Carter mentioned, all of the galleries will have different mediums integrated into them, including film and video throughout the building, but that we had certain works that really benefited from this kind of theatrical presentation, and we wanted to make sure people understood that they're part of the show, as well as the works in the theater lobby, which are adjacent to the Education Center, as you know. So just to kind of, frame that more broadly. And the other thing I want to say about these section titles and the way we thought of the sections, what I think Donna was really good at sort of framing big picture, is that we, in our discoveries and our kind of thinking and our tinkering, we started with sometimes categories, movements that people might have in their head. And this is a good example of one where you might know, okay, Ed Ruscha, now we're talking about pop art. And some of our sections will feel more familiar to you as maybe chapters that you know from art history. The Abstract Expressionism show Carter showed you, Abstract Expressionism Gallery, the Pop Art Gallery would do that. But in each case, we tried to kind of jostle the narrative within the accepted canon. At the same time, some of the other sections are things you might never have heard of or even thought about before. And so you're going to have to kind of alternate in your thinking, and I'll point out to it a few of those are where we kind of like invented our own categories. Even when Carter was talking about machine ornament, and he mentioned precisionism, it's really not a precisionist gallery. So there are works from precisionism there, but there are also things like photographs by Steichen that you wouldn't associate with precisionism. And so you'll kind of develop ways of hinting at some of the art history people maybe know, the art history you know, but then a little bit adjusting for how we've kind of twisted the narrative with some of the new works that Dana mentioned and some of the thinking that Donna put in. So I just wanted to kind of say that before I jump into Large Trademark, which, as I said, is sort of basically the core of our pop collection, but then a little bit rethought. And here you see, of course, the Ed Ruscha Large Trademark, and the way that the 6th floor is introduced, you'll see, is with a series of kind of free-floating walls, each of which has a kind of billboard-like painting, the Ruscha, the Wesselmann, and later Peter Saul Saigon. And we wanted to give people a sense of the expanding scale of painting at this time, that sense of the billboard as a kind of commercial reference, and also, of course, the floor plate there grows, both the ceiling height from the 7th floor and the kind of just scale of it. So you get a new sense of what these paintings are up to. We're thinking a lot about politics in this show, by and large. We were sort of surprised at the depth of our holdings across the century in terms of how they spoke to different specific political moments, like Carter mentioned about the lynching prince in the 30s. And we found that in the 30s and the 60s and the 80s and the 90s, even today, we used to think we had different core periods that reflected that. I think it's almost consistent throughout. And you'll see ways in which, I think politics is maybe too specific of a word because you start to think Republican, Democrat, something like that. But the way that these artists were thinking about this place of America, as Donna and Adam were speaking about, and how that got reflected in their work. So on the back wall in this gallery, you're going to find a kind of amazing lineup, and I'll show you 4 pictures from that with Jasper Johns' icon of the collection, 3 Flags, and the Alan D'Arcangelo, Madonna and Child, which is a kind of new icon of the collection. We only acquired this a few years ago, but it was such a standout in sinister pop that people started to think of it, and it got reproduced everywhere. And Dana very cleverly or intelligently discovered in working on the handbook that this picture of actually Jacqueline and Carolyn Kennedy as these kind of saints, faceless saints, made in 1963 was made, in fact, before the assassination of JFK. We had thought it was made after, based on some misinformation. And it's even eerier to imagine an artist, a young artist at this time, thinking about the First Lady and her daughter as these saints that have maybe been, beatified or kind of in this, they're already absent from us. Also on that wall, you'll see the Warhol Coca-Cola bottles, but a kind of discovery from in our own collection, this kind of shopping in our closet that we did, Malcolm Bailey work from 1969 that's hard to read here, but shows kind of the hold in a slave ship with the different figures on the left and right, as well as a cotton ball in the middle. And the way that his sense of diagramming, his graphic vocabulary, repetition relates to Warhol, but also the kind of sense of American products, cotton, consumerism, labor, these ideas between slavery, let's say, and exporting Coca-Cola, I think will really help kind of change that narrative. Going forward from there, you see a section called Raw War, named after this Bruce Nauman lithograph, which is a kind of interesting sort of subset. We used to have a category in our mind called the political 60s, then it became the political 60s and 70s, and really sort of mapping from these kind of social turmoil of this period, Vietnam, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, so many different issues in American life were being investigated by artists, and we were just thrilled and surprised and a little jolted by the number of works that made these kind of points. On the left, the video of Howard Lester showing all the soldiers who were killed in a single week in Vietnam with a kind of pop soundtrack. On the right, another work about Angela Davis. In fact, these works are on the same wall. This one by Peter Saul showing her impaled on the Department of Justice. It'd be great to see this with the Faith Ringgold for the first time. In this room, we also have kind of different ideas about violence, militarism, bondage. Larry Clark, with the gun from his famous series of Tulsa, the Nancy Grossman head, ideas about the body in extremis, about our culture at that time thinking about the body as a site, of course, sending soldiers abroad, but also many of these discussions in terms of the women's rights movement or the civil rights movement were about the characteristics of all of these citizens, whether they were black or women, and those kind of issues will come forward, as you'll see in the next floor. So here we are down on the 5th floor. Far west side, you saw the Jonathan Borofsky painting the mural from the river, which actually really relates to this section called Thread and Sanctuary, which is broadly, we thought of it as a section about 1970s painting. And that's kind of interesting because I think for many people, the idea of 1970s painting was like, well, what was that? Didn't minimalism and conceptual art sort of suggest that painting had died? And of course, we know that painting never died. And I think one of the interesting things about this show in general, and I've noticed this as we work on the section text, is that a lot of the stories and narratives that we sort of reach for when we say, well, but painting had died. But then we think, well, we've had paintings in every gallery throughout. So how could we say that, including our minimalism gallery? We've had figuration, even when there were moments of abstraction, as you'll see with the de Kooning painting in Abex. And the kind of, I think, openness of the Whitney Museum as a collecting institution, its history and the way we've approached this, the kind of lack of a doctrinaire point of view and a kind of expansiveness of going where artists go and accepting in a way that at any one time, one of the section texts actually talked about the pluralism of the 70s. And I thought, well, that's kind of funny because we've been showing pluralism in every decade on View. So how has making this show actually caused us as curators to even think about some of those terms will make it difficult to explain this show for those of you who have a narrative, but exciting. And I think you'll be learning, and so will the audience as they move through. So this is a great Neil Jenny painting. And this gallery sort of breaks into two main ideas. And one is about figure, in a way, or figurative painting in the 70s. And that's associated with the phrase new image painting, which some of you will know was an important exhibition that the Whitney hosted, and artists like Jenny were in that. You see the great Susan Rothenberg on the right, and Augustin, who is not part of that show, on the left. But Augustin is one of those interesting figures who, of course, in a way made his name during abstract expressionism as an abstract painter and then famously returned to the figure, and that was a very liberating thing for many artists of his period. Gustin is a good point for me to mention that one thing we thought about is that artists will recur throughout our exhibition. So many of them, not many, but a certain number are represented by 2 works, and a few of them are represented by as many as 4 works. And when they're often represented at different moments in time, so that we're showing that the Whitney has a kind of commitment to artists over their careers, that we don't just finish with them when they're young after a biennial. We're watching them, we're including them in the narrative as their work changes in relation to the time in which they're living. So in fact, Gustin is in the lynching section with a wonderful drawing. He's in the abstract expressionist section with a wonderful painting. And here he is again in 1977. It'll be fun for you, for those of you who are moving throughout the building, to see artists like Ellsworth Kelly, Jasper Johns, Gustin, Georgia O'Keeffe in these different sections. Also in this section is a kind of the more abstract corollary of artists kind of reinventing painting, not through the image, but abstractly, trying to pour things, smear things. The Jack Whitten and the Robert Reed both show the artist really working physically with painting in an almost sculptural way. It's interesting to mention about these 2 paintings that these are both by Black artists, and that at this time in the 70s, the Whitney had a very pioneering role in supporting Black artists, giving them a series of shows in the Lobby Gallery. Jack Whitten was one of them, and this recent acquisition, in fact, was shown in the Lobby Gallery in the Breuer Building. Robert Reed, unfortunately, just died a few months ago, but taught for many years at Yale, and we're very excited to be bringing this painting out of storage for the first time in decades. Again, mentioning artists who you'll see throughout, Racing Thoughts of Jasper Johns. That's the title for a kind of room about the 80s. I want to stress that when you go into these rooms, especially if there are any artists on your tours, this isn't the 80s. It's a story from the 80s or about the 80s. We don't imagine that this narrative that we're presenting on all these floors is definitive. It's not the story of American art. It's multiple stories of American art, and there are a lot of other stories we could tell. So that's a really important thing to remember. And the story that we're telling about the 80s really has to do with this kind of image culture of the 80s, artists thinking about the media, about pop, about TV, about magazine ads, about the things they grew up with, this generation of artists in the baby boom, the first American generation to grow up with TV. And you see Barbara Kruger and David Sally, which introduced this floor with these 2 works. It was another kind of discovery for us with the Sally piece, because it hasn't been shown in many years. Actually, it was, I think, acquired by Barbara Haskell, and David was really excited to know that we were showing it. But both the Kruger and the Sally are almost the same size, both depict men and women, this graphic vocabulary in the same palette, and became a kind of guiding pair for us. And the Sally, which is on the west side, kind of points towards that painting moment, and the Barbara Kruger on the east points towards a more conceptual and political moment, as you'll see. Also in this gallery, we have artists thinking about how artworks themselves became subject to the market, how the exploding market of the 1980s for art was something that these artists self-consciously considered in their work, whether in the case of Louise Lawler showing us this wonderful Warhol from the Tremaine collection on the block up at auction, or Charlie Ray basically turning a display object like a mannequin into a kind of sculpture, a portrait, a rendition of a person that's blown up, this boy. So this really shows this kind of commercial interest in artists in the 80s and how their work kind of took that on and internalized it. Another, I think, really powerful gallery in terms of the political is this gallery, Love Letter from the War Front, which really deals with the AIDS crisis in America, and particularly in New York, and particularly within the artistic community. And we started out thinking a lot about David Keel's wonderful show, Ayu We, that I'm sure many of you know, which was a real example for us, and how a lot of those works it kind of covered the waterfront in terms of being both very politically engaged, activist art, if you will, which we kind of reference through the wallpaper that you'll see on the 5th floor of Donald Moffat, He Kills Me, which is a statement about Reagan's failure to acknowledge the AIDS crisis. But we also were trying to think about this in almost more personal terms. And this gallery becomes a little bit more along those lines. This title is a title of a work by Felix Gonzalez-Torres, A Little Puzzle, that depicts a love letter that was written to his boyfriend who died of AIDS. Both of them did, in fact, as did most of the artists who are in this room. And we wanted to show on the one side some artists before the AIDS crisis, in fact, early Mark Morris Row. This is actually 85, it's just after, but we have a wonderful self-portrait of his. Nan Golden, who documented many of her friends in the gay community, also performers, whatnot, in the Ballad of Sexual Dependency, this sense of life that she captured so poignantly, and as a kind of real sort of touchstone to then what AIDS did to that community. And it was important for us to think about the neighborhood that we're in. As Adam said, it's interesting that this neighborhood at once was a time for cruising, for gay bars, for, if any of you went to Florent in the 80s, you would remember maybe seeing a drag queen and a construction driver and Roy Lichtenstein, a construction worker, all having lunch together. And that was around the corner from us. And this is a picture of Peter Hujar lighting up, of David Warner-Rovich lighting up on the West Side, taken by Peter Hujar, who was his sometimes boyfriend and mentor and collaborator. And then on the right, you see Warner-Rovich's picture of Peter Hujar after he died, shortly after he died of AIDS. Both of these men did die of AIDS, and it's kind of amazing that within our collection we were able to find ways of telling the story about these interpersonal connections between artists, about this community, without feeling, I think, sentimental, but what this dialogue meant and what that devastation was. Another gallery, I only have a few more, don't worry, it's called Guarded View. And for those of you who know the Whitney for a long time, you'll know that in the early 90s we had a great moment, Thelma Golden was very involved with, Elizabeth Sussman, of course, of artists who were really considering how race, how sexual identity, how gender are formed both in the way we think of ourselves and the way other people perceive us. And I think that that's a kind of crucial thing in this gallery, and really the body as a kind of point of view, a kind of contested site. So you have Jimmy Durham's great piece on the left, a Native American artist, and David Hammond's on the right with the hair, African-American hair. As well, we have these two pictures, one by Lutz Batcher, a recent acquisition, that's a kind of Vargas joke that she took. She says, sure, I'm for the feminist movement. In fact, I'm pretty good at it. So she, as a woman artist, took this image and then this joke about feminism and had another male artist actually repaint it for her. And then you see Kathy Opie on the right, who's a lesbian artist who's now married, has kids. This work was actually made before she was married and before it was legal. So even some of these images of family and the way that artists are reflecting on that will tie into a lot of what's going on today that you read about in the newspaper. Some of the images that Carter talked about with the lynchings. It's just amazing in terms of the way we're talking in this city right now and in this country about things that are happening in Ferguson and other places. Distracting Distance is the penultimate section. And we started out thinking about maybe a kind of digital art gallery, like, okay, what happens after 2000? People get computers. And the idea evolved in a more complex way to kind of move away from the internet, that was a sort of thing, sort of guiding force, but that all these different artists were actually reflecting in many ways on the kind of status of the image, how images move throughout our culture, whether it's from your phone to the internet to a book. How are these kind of strange amphibians that are halfway digital and halfway printed, and how an artist like Rebecca Quaitman, here, you'll remember this from the biennial, was reflecting on our painting Early Sunday Morning of Hopper with Kate Hardy, who is an artist that was also in the biennial, posed in the Breuer Building. So we brought the Breuer Building with us, not to be nostalgic, but to show these artists kind of working through these questions. This wonderful new acquisition by Carol Beauvais on the left that kind of uses images as kind of out of books, and the books themselves conjure the story of the 60s and the 70s, but seen through the eyes of a young woman that was kind of thinking about her parents' generation today. On the right's a detail from a great Kelly Walker work, which has many panels that you can't see. I just gave you a detail, which show him investigating these old Volkswagen ads that he scanned and then manipulated the computer and then reprinted by hand. So how we're kind of working back and forth between our iPhones and the books we read, and how this image culture that we're living in is maybe a little bit nostalgic. Super Mario is a kind of old video game. It's sort of, this room ended up having a rather melancholy vibe in a way that I don't think we expected. Wade Guyton's kind of sort of fragile monochrome from his jam printer, but it'll be interesting to think about these works at a moment when people maybe are thinking it's so forward-looking, and they were also optimistic about these technologies, but that there's a kind of subtle sense of loss alive in the room. And finally, Course of Empire, which you all know this work from our collection and from the great show that Donna did after Rouché's presentation in the Venice Biennale, where the paintings that he made, inspired by Thomas Cole's Course of Empire, reflecting on literally the rise and fall of a civilization, became a kind of guiding light for us as we thought, what did it mean for artists after 2000, after Hurricane Katrina, after 9/11, after the financial catastrophe of 2008, how were they reflecting, contemporary artists, in their work on this changed world and on this changed America? I was just working on the section text for that today, and thinking about the American century and that last show that we had in 2000 that some of you I'm sure gave tours of and know, and this idea that we're really not in the American century anymore, that term comes from Henry Luce in 1941, writing in Life magazine about how the US is going to be this leader in the world, and the world has changed. And what does it mean to be a museum of American art in this more global era as we invite more tourists, as these artists, I think as Dana said, are kind of questioning these definitions about who an American is, what it is, and what is our place in the world. So one side of this gallery reflects on the idea of this kind of imagined landscape, maybe this post-apocalyptic landscape. On the left, we're not sure if this woman's emerging from the sand, if she's the last woman alive. The trees are felled, but there are flowers blooming. On the right, a great Nicole Eisenman painting, recent acquisition, showing this kind of strange scene in a bar. We keep talking about it. It's like, you know, early morning in Brooklyn or something, with artists drinking whatever, this dystopia. And then on the other side of the gallery, you'll see works that more directly reflect on politics and current events. And again, one of these artists who keeps recurring, Ellsworth Kelly, and you see his wonderful collage that we're so lucky to have about his proposal for Ground Zero, basically a big green Ellsworth Kelly or park. And then on the right, this is misleading because this painting is so small, a recent gift of Elizabeth Peyton painting of Barack and Michelle Obama sharing this kind of tender moment. And we wanted moments like that, a sense that this is not all doom and gloom, but that there's a excitement about having our first black president and, you know, what that could mean in this changed world. So I hope that you'll enjoy giving tours of the show and kind of pointing to a lot of those issues as you move through the galleries. That's all I have to say. I don't know who's...
Thank you.
Thank you, Dana, Scott, Carter. So just to sort of sum up, and then we are going to take some questions, and maybe we'll have some answers, I hope. You know, one of the biggest challenges here was dealing with 115 years of history as represented in our permanent collection. That's a huge span. You know, we want to emphasize that this is not a summation, nor is it a survey. And I think as my colleagues articulate it, you see that there are certain strands that we have mined very deeply here. And I think that are about a provocation, an opportunity to push beyond the established categories that Scott spoke of earlier, the definitions we know of whether it's precisionism or even abstract expressionism or minimalism, and to move beyond those. And that, in a sense, is they're a bit of polemic at time, but that's what we really wanted to do. And I think that the strands of the 30s, the 60s, the 80s, the political moment, and this relationship between artists and culture and society is something that I think is very unique in many ways to the Whitney's collection. Now, whether that's because we are a collection of American art, I'm not sure, but I think it has a lot to do with it. It has a lot to do with our exhibition history over many, many years. I think one of the things that will come up, and we want to be incredibly sensitive about, is this, all the great artists are here, are the artists who are not in this presentation. And so I think it's very important to make clear that this is really it's a beginning. It's a critical beginning. And in a way, America is hard to see, becomes very convenient on many, many levels because there is so much to see. It's why we've built this building. It's the opportunity we're going to have year after year after year. So I think it's important to emphasize to people this is a selection. It's a selection based on a series of narratives and almost essays, if you will. The sections almost function as essays and provocations, pushing the envelope. But again, it is not a tidy summation, and I think there'll be many more to come. Many of the artists who are not on view here will be on view into the future. The greats, of course, the Hoppers, the Calders, those will be on the more regular view because we know our public likes them, and it's an opportunity people don't have actually, particularly from outside the United States, to see those works. So we need you as our ambassadors out there to also just be very, very sensitive, as I know you all are, because you may have that question from people, why isn't so-and-so, or even in your daily goings through. We need to message to people the importance of that we are a family and we believe in all the artists that are in our collection. It is just physically impossible to show 22,000, or what is the actual number of artists now that we have in the collection, Dana? 3,000 artists. And I was we were joking before, and I said, gee, it might have been a lot easier if we'd just gone from A to Z. And everybody got one work, beginning at A, ending at Z. And we could have stopped like months ago and all got on vacation. I don't think it would have been a very interesting show, and I think people would have been really bored after a while if we had done that. But someone might have been happy as well. But that's a really important point that we need you to emphasize in the most positive way, because it's not a negative, it's a positive. And now they'll have a great new building to show their work in. So I think we want to open this up to questions that people might have, and this is really for everybody on the core team, so just, you know. Oh, you have, I'm sorry, okay. Okay. We were so clear you have no questions, or I'm not certain.
They're all ready to go. They're giving it.
What's the current total, Mia, of number of works that are in right now? 685 check back. As I say, covers literally about 115 years. Well, the only title actually that is not taken from a painting per se is probably Course of Empire is a series.
Eight West Days.
Pardon me?
8 West Days.
8 West Days.
It's taken from,
Yeah.
yeah, and sometimes we excerpted the titles from a larger title, but they're all based in titles.
Yeah, we didn't make these titles up. We tried to be authentic about it because you can hear a lot of titles made up that, you know, we know what those are. But it's better to have the voice of the artist to say those.
Someone on a tour is bound to ask if it's a Museum of American Art, why Renzo Piano was selected as the architect. How would you answer that?
He's a great architect who loves art and museums. And, you know, one of the things that I remember Adam saying early on is that they asked many artists, who is your favorite architect? And these were artists involved with the Whitney, and they named Renzo Piano. So, you know, that's a huge thing. He's a very sensitive architect to art.
Marcel Breuer was not an American architect either.
Well,
That's a good question.
was he American? Did he become?
Okay.
He became American, I think.
How much overlap is there between the 2001 catalog or handbook and the current handbook?
It's for Dana.
Stand up, they wanted to hear or use a mic.
Yeah, I have the number. Hold on one sec.
You asked, you're going to get the answer.
Yeah. All right, bear with me. So it will have to be between the artists, because, you know, the count doesn't really work for objects, because if you actually looked at the numbers I put up, I said 22% pre-war and 80% post-war, you know, didn't add up to 100. But that's because artists are sometimes represented on the same page with a pre-war work and a post-war work. Okay, so the question is, how many of the artists in the 2001 book are in the 2015 book? 204. So that means we have 78 upset artists, probably, to anticipate. I mean, you should
we'll
look
be
at the
writing
old
Adam.
handbook. You know, like it's. I think each good handbook is in some ways a signal of its times, and that it should advocate on behalf of the curators and the things that they believe should be surfaced that might not be. But again, as I said, I think the knowledge that our entire collection was going to be available on the website really did change the landscape for us in making these decisions.
May I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
Is there a lot of overlap between the works, the actual works of those artists in the two handbooks? Or have you chosen different works from one particular artist for the new handbook?
Barry.
I would say it's a mixture. So there are artists like Linda Banglis, who was in the old one and is in the new one, but it was Travel Agent, the small wall-mounted piece in the old one, and in the new one, it's Contraband. So in some cases, we've had amazing acquisitions by artists that we've been following and were included previously, but we didn't have those in 2001. And some of the slides that I cut from my presentation, because I was told it needed to be cut down, you know, indicates that since 2001, you know, the number of gifts, the major gifts that we've received. So there was the gift to New York, the trustees gift that was spearheaded by Leonard Lauder in 2002, the Emily Fisher Landau collection. the promise gifts of Sandra Gilman, 75 photographs, Thea and Ethan Westreich Wagner, that gift. So those are 4 major gifts that have come in since then. And we tried not to, show all of the best things because we're cognizant they're going to have their own catalogs and, we don't want to steal the thunder. But in each case, there were really spectacular examples that we included. So, the overlap, I think, has to take into account how many more works were brought into the museum in the last 15 years. But it is also funny, everyone keeps thinking that, like, we're skewing so old. But what we realized is that all these artists that we thought were under 50 were actually not under 50. So all of the people who we've been sort of working with and that we've come up with, whether it's Carol Beauvais or Josephine Mexepper or Rachel Harrison, by the time the book comes out, they're not under 50. So that's why we had a specific heading for 50 to 60 years old. If there was some computerized algorithm that we could have created to get the right combination, I would have built it. It was a very painful, long process, and of course it's very hard to. Adam's laughing because he was intimately involved, but the hope is that you get something of the right mix and that it represents the Whitney and represents a little bit of the sense of discovery that has defined the Whitney from the beginning.
Good question.
Anyone else? This is your chance.
Yeah.
I guess along the lines of the catalog, I'm thinking, obviously at MoMA, you've got the gift shop, you've got the design store. At MoMA, or at the Met, you have the gifts. At the end of the show, you have the bookstore. At the Whitney, we had the gift shop in the lower level, and it's been back and forth. In terms of a bookstore, in terms of merchandising as part of shows, is that going to be something that's part of the new Whitney more than it was before? Or what's the philosophy there, I guess?
We are. Yes, we're going to have a bookstore that's on the lobby level, and Jen Heslin, our colleague who's overseeing the bookstore, I think is developing artists. I think it's going to be very particular, with a selection of books, artist product, so very distilled and really, in a sense, reflecting the mission of the institution, and right there on the level 1 or floor 1. Anyone else? The one thing I just wanted to point out is that there's one work that we actually did not reference, and that is the Douglas Davis World's Longest Sentence, which is in our collection, which is a digital work, and which I believe will be online. Christian Paul, I'm looking out at you. Because it's actually our digital work that is part of the collection, so I wanted to make certain to reference that. Question?
I'm not sure if I missed this, but when you're talking about the outdoor space,
Uh-huh.
how much of that, sorry, hi again.
Sure.
How much of that will be permanent installation and how much of it is left for programs and
Well, conceivably, it's all part of our programmatic space. It's 13,000 square feet of outdoor space, and the 8th floor has a cafe level, so during the seasonal months, there'll be actually tables out there, although I will say that there will be a sculpture out there as part of the opening installation. But we really designed all of them so that they could be used as an extension, almost as if you think of the gallery as one floor that continues out. It's the kind of gallery without walls. So we'll take any space over that we can. What can I say? But that's how the building was designed, so that we can use those. And for the opening display, you'll see that we will have on 8, 7, 6, and the maintenance and operation roof of the Highline, which is accessible from the 5th floor. All of those will be occupied with works of art. One more, I think, and then Adam, you want to speak?
I have another question. Is that okay?
I don't know. I'm not running this, so ask
We've
Catherine.
been talking about 5 through 8. What's happening on floors 2, 3, and 4?
Well, on the third floor is where our theater is located, and also the Loriam Tisch Education Center, where there'll be drop-in programming. So the theater space, which is open to the public, which Scott mentioned that we'll be having regular screenings. There are also works on view in the theater lobby as well. I think the second floor is a place if you have a wrench you go to, because I believe it's just all mechanical, basically. And the fourth floor, I'm sure you'd be welcome to stop by and stuff envelopes and things, because it's really, those are office spaces. But the way the building, it's interesting, it's the way you think of the building and the floor numbers, it could be a little confusing for people, because 5 sounds so far off, but it's really not that far off. But 2 and 3 are kind of a mezzanine, 3 is and 4 are mezzanine spaces. But you'll be able to go. The other thing, if you've been in the building, from the lobby level, you can take the large staircase, which goes to the theater level, which is on 3, and then you can also take that. It's a direct route up to the 5th floor temporary exhibition gallery. And of course, the elevators go to all the spaces, and then the mezzanine level where there's coat, bathrooms, and you'll have our map that has all the different aspects for amenities for restrooms, the cafe, and the restaurant, and the bookstore. One more, and then Adam, do you want to take one more? Sorry.
Is there one floor that is devoted to the permanent collection as it was the 5th floor in the other building?
There'll be 2 floors when all of this comes down. The building was always conceptualized, and the 2 floors that have the different ceiling treatment, which you'll see, it's a closed ceiling. Both those floors will be devoted permanently. Although I could never say permanently because, like biennials and things ahead. But those are designated for the permanent collection. And it was really one of the major reasons for this building, frankly. I think it's about 22,000 square feet ultimately for the permanent collection versus whatever we had on 5, which you all know. So Adam, I'm going to hand it over to you.
First of all, I want to thank the curators to get their presentation. It's hard to sum it up in a very short time. I mean, this represents years of work and years of thinking on the part of all the team and the curators and curatorial assistants. So thank you all, and thank you for the presentation. I mean, as I look at it, one of the things that I'm struck by, as I was when I went through the installation itself, is that it's very complex, it's very layered. The whole idea of America is hard to see is that it is a very complicated, layered, subtle, nuanced story. And we didn't want to have an exhibition where basically you check it off and you know all the artist names and you go through it. It's like a little checklist. The idea was to slow people down. Remember, a museum is about looking and about experiencing. And I think the curatorial team did an amazing job of getting people to see these things that they're excited that they know, but then to stop and say, what is that? Who is this by? How does this fit in? It asks as many questions as it actually posits directions. And that, to me, is the success of a great installation. The other thing, too, and to just echo what Donna said, there are many artists who couldn't be in this first iteration of it. And, and it's too bad. But on the other hand, the job of the curator, just like the job of the contemporary artist, is to take a risk. And what that means is staking a claim and making a commitment. It's not about lining all the artists up A to Z, which Donna was joking about. But obviously, it'd be a lot easier to do. But to make a statement that has points to it, and to put themselves out there. And I think that that's something the Whitney's always done historically very well. And then the last thing I just wanted to say, and as I look at so many of these works here, and I look at the credit lines on these works, and I look at, first of all, the numbers of generations of people who built this collection. A museum, whether it's its buildings or its collections or its curators, it's a layer upon layer. We all build on top of what our predecessors have done. I mean, Gertrude had the first idea of what it might possibly be. But there were generations of directors and curators and other people involved in the museum. And I'm looking at Barbara Haskell there, and as I see so many of these pieces that we acquired over time, and so many of the acquisitions that you were involved in over very many years. And this is a tribute to all of the curators and also to the great generosity of artists, and so many artists whose names are in these credit lines, and donors who gave these works. And the last little piece is, to refer first to what Dana said about the building has become a great magnet for collection building. Many of those collections that came to the museum in the last 10 years came on the condition of actually there being more space to show it. And I think it's how we got the Westreich Wagner collection, the Gilman collection, the Emily Landau collection came because of that. And we hope that this will be a place, when we saw this with many artists as they went through, that they could see their art, imagine their work on that wall, and we hope that many collectors do the same. And Catherine did ask me to please mention the Richard Archwager elevators, because I don't know if he counts in the numbers of artists, but he should. He's there permanently. But I think most of you are aware that we commissioned Richard Archwager to do all of the elevators. It's a piece. It's his last piece that he did before he died. It's called 6 and 4. It's the 6 themes that he did throughout his lifetime in these 4 elevators. And as Renzo Piano likes to say, this is the museum where the art comes to you and you don't have to go to the art. We're still perfecting the elevators now. I think they have a wonderful accessibility. I remember as a youngster coming to the Whitney and seeing the Calder Circus in the lobby, and it being that user-friendly piece that was also at the same time a great work of art, a signature work of art. The circus could never be shown in the lobby again because of light and conditions, but the idea that these elevators, Richard Archwager, an artist who we have a very long history with, 2 retrospectives, largest collection of his work of any museum, is at the core, literally at the center of the museum. And each night we'll bring them down to the lobby and open the doors and dim the lights in the lobby. It'll be the one time you'll see them all together. It's a wonderful way to go by the museum even when it's closed at night. So I want to thank you all for what you've done, and even more so for what you're about to do. So thanks.